In 1848, as before, there's also a radical levelling minority, and at this stage I think we can start to call them left Republicans or socialist Republicans who opposed this, but the unity of the movement came first. In the 1860s, a new movement called the Fenians arose, and that played a major role in the creation of the Land League. Now, this led to a 12-year land war that mobilised hundreds of thousands of peasants in a battle with landlords that very often came down to physical violence. But the Fenians as an organisation decided not to pursue that strategy, despite the fact that some of the leaders were instrumental in setting up the Land League, and some Fenian leaders, particularly those in the United States at the time, denounced it as divisive because it pitted Irish landlords against their tenants. The Land League is the high tide of the radical republicanism that began in 1798. Sectarianism had re-established itself in the aftermath of the 1798 rebellion, but at the time of the Land League, it was able to use orange halls for meetings in the first months of the campaign. Some of the Fenian leaders were well to the left, including at least one who was also actually a member of the First International and who corresponded with Marx. There was a small section of the International in Ireland itself, and even later a tiny anarchist group in Dublin. And in fact, one of the interesting things I found recently was during the Land War, the British anarchist newspaper Freedom published a number of accounts from evictions and resistance to evictions. They'd sent correspondents to Ireland, and they also seemed to have people reporting from Ireland. The Fenians, one thing I'll mention in passing is, of course, there's a direct connection with Ontario here because the American section, the Fenians, mounted 3 invasions of Ontario in this period using Irish troops that were demobilised in the aftermath of the US Civil War. So basically, they recruited an army of 5,000 to 6,000 from both Union and Confederate soldiers who had demobilised and invaded Ontario via Vermont, Buffalo and Detroit. In general, though, this is the historical period at which the idea of working-class revolution is coming to the fore across Europe and North America. You know, we're talking about the 1860s and the 1870s. In Ireland, it resulted in the Catholic Church red-baiting the Fenians. And there's a subsequent shift by many Republicans in response to that back towards a cultural nationalist agenda that seeks to bury the divisive issues around class that existed within the Republican movement, behind the idea of a common Irish identity. So there's a Republican-driven revival of the Irish language, of Irish sports and culture, in opposition to what was identified as foreign influence in these areas. That succeeded in reinforcing a sort of cross-class nationalist unity, but this is at the price of reversing the process that had begun in the 1790s, so that Irishness in the period of the 1890s comes to be increasingly defined as Catholic, Gaelic and peasant. That might have worked relatively well in the south in terms of building a movement, but it was to have disastrous consequences in the north of the country. The left in this period is continuing to grow, and it's becoming a significant force in its own right. In particular in the early 1900s as the syndicalist wave arrived in Ireland, and there's a rapid growth in revolutionary syndicalism. In part, that's driven by returned immigrants who'd organised with the IWW in North America and brought some of that organisational methodology back to Ireland. In 1913, the Dublin employers tried to smash this wave in a year-long lockout of union members, and that's followed 3 years later by the 1916 Rising in Dublin, when an alliance of militant nationalists and the workers' militia formed during the lockout to protect the striking workers, seized key buildings in Dublin City. They fought the British Army for about a week, and during that period, in the suppression of the Rising, most of the city centre was destroyed. The Dublin left made a very significant contribution to the Rising. Connolly, of course, James Connolly is famous as being one of the leaders of the Rising. He had been a member of the IWW and the Socialist Labour Party in the States. But in fact, around 20% of the total combatants were from the Irish Citizen Army, whose origins lay in that revolutionary syndicalist union, the ITGWU. And other participants in the Rising recorded at the time that, at least for some of them, the military revolution was to be followed by the industrial revolution. The programme of the Rising itself, the 1916 proclamation, is pretty long on rhetoric about dead generations and august destiny, but short in any sort of concrete programme, never mind one that addressed the needs of the working class in Ireland at the time. And Connolly was quoted a week before the Rising in addressing an Irish Citizens' Army rally as saying, if we should win, hold on to your rifles, because the volunteers, the nationalists, may have a different goal. Remember, we're not out just for political liberty, but for economic liberty as well. So the left at the time was aware of the lack of economic equality in the proclamation, that it wasn't really an issue dealt with. And as usual, in reaching a compromise between socialism and republicanism, the socialist element is pushed to one side. It's left to be sorted out later. Connolly, in fact, himself, writing 17 years before 1916, wrote that what this would mean was that after Ireland is free, says the patriot, who won't touch socialism, we will protect all classes, and if you won't pay your rent, you will be evicted, same as now. With the evicting party under command of the sheriff will wear green uniforms and the harp without the crown, and the warrant turning you out of the roadside will be stamped with the arms of the Irish Republic. Now, isn't that worth fighting for? And that's very much what happened then in the South. The rebellion in 1916 is followed 2 years later by the Anglo-Irish War, sometimes called the War of Independence, and then, because of differences over the treaty that ended that war, by a bitter civil war. Now, almost everyone is unaware of the fact that during this period there's an intense wave of class struggle between 1918 and 1923. There were 5 general strikes in southern and western Ireland, so that's more or less national strikes, between August 1918 and August 1923, and no less than 18 general local strikes where cities or entire counties go on strike. 12 of these take place in 1919. In the course of these strikes, workers take over the running of towns and cities across Ireland. The most famous example is the 1919 Limerick Soviet. That's relatively well documented. But it happened even in some quite small towns like Dungarvan in County Waterford. And in 1918, for 1 month in Dungarvan, nothing could be bought or sold without a union permit. Nothing could enter the town without union permission. People who tried to break the blockade had their carts overturned and their goods destroyed. The strike committee set up its own rationing and distribution system. So, locally you do have, town-wide examples of workers' power that, go on for a month, go on for 2 weeks. Landless labourers across Ireland take part in land occupations and in cattle drives. Workers occupied their workplaces and sought to keep production going, and there were pitched battles fought between workers and police, Republican police, and even self-styled white guards set up by employers. In one part of the country around Dungarvan, it actually resulted in trench warfare at one point. Of the general strike of April 1920, the Manchester Guardian noted that the direction of affairs passed during the strike to these workers' councils, which were formed not on a local but on a class basis. In most places, the police abdicated, and the maintenance of order was taken over by the local workers' council. In fact, it is no exaggeration to trace the flavour of proletarian dictatorship about some aspects of the strike. But writing about this, the syndicalist historian Emmett O'Connor says that despite the true value of the strike, these had a huge impact on the ability of the British Army to wage warfare, in particular the strikes on the trains, which meant that they couldn't move troops and munitions around the country. In spite of this, Dáil Éireann never sought to invoke a strike or attempt to manipulate political strikes once they'd begun. Employing a weapon of social conflict would have run counter to Sinn Féin's integration strategy. And in fact, the IRA is ordered repeatedly in this period to move against workers' struggles. Ernie O'Malley, who was the officer commanding the 2nd Division of the IRA, summarised this afterwards when he wrote, "There was land trouble in the south and west. The Dáil, afraid of the spread of land hunger, used the IRA to protect landowners. The IRA, who were in sympathy with those who wanted to break up estates, ended up carrying out the orders of the Minister of Defence." So during the Anglo-Irish War, you have a complete breakdown of law and order. Basically, the IRA target police barracks and destroy them all over the country, forcing the police to retreat to the major cities. And this is part of the reason why you have so many workplace and factory occupations, because once the police are removed from the scene, there's nothing to stop workers taking places over.